Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I hope I can live up to that now. No pressure. So my name's Katherine Leaman. I run a regulatory compliance consultancy practice called Leaman Crellin Limited. We specialise in certain areas, technical areas of the rules where, having been a compliance officer, I think it's fair to say advisory teams don't want to get into, like client asset protection and outsourcing. They're quite technical, complicated areas. So I've made it my business to specialise in them. And obviously our topic today, the senior manager and certification regimes. I've worked in insurance, I've worked in distribution, I've worked in banking, I've worked in regulation, now I'm consulting. So I've been around the industry a little bit. During my time at the regulator, I developed the professional standards regime for investment advisors, and as a result of that, I developed, worked very closely on the approved person regime, as it was at the time. That's the predecessor to the senior manager and conduct regime. But because of that work, I developed some of the standards that we see today now in SM&CR. So I like to think I've got a few sort of probably more detailed technical insights. I'm not going to make this a super detailed technical presentation today. What I really want to do with you is just talk to you a little bit about the regimes themselves, then get into where I see there's common problems. The regimes have been around for 3 years for the banks, for getting on for nearly 2 years actually in the insurance sector, and coming next month, everybody else is going to have to meet these standards. So there's a few problem areas I can talk about. I've tried to address them particularly directing towards a compliance and a risk audience, because I think that's what we have here today. But if there are any elements as I go through this, then just stop me, or we'll do questions at the end, or catch me in the breaks. So let's just start with a little bit of history and a little bit of a refresh on why we've got what we've got. I think that's useful context, because you will hear the regulators refer to some of these key buzzwords, phrases quite a lot, and it's quite helpful, I think, to know some of the background. It came about following the financial crisis, when the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards, frequently referred to as the PCBS and still referred to in that way, you'll hear people talk about it a lot, they discovered during their independent review on banking standards that the UK approved person regime at the time didn't allow the regulator at the time, the Financial Services Authority, to adequately take action against individuals. And this was a real thorn in their side as they went through the independent review that they carried out. When Parliament then considered what was at the time the proposed Banking Reform Act, as part of its post-crisis measures, it was looking at things like ring fencing. Parliament decided it was the right thing to do to empower the successor regulators, the one we know today, Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority, that they should be able to hold individuals to account. And that's why we have the SM&CR, the Individual Accountability Regime, as it's also referred to. Alongside creation of the Senior Manager and Certification Regime, the PRA and the FCA were given powers by Parliament to create rules for conduct of employees of all regulated firms. And this was something that it was very much in the gift of the regulators to decide the scope, the applicability, and what those rules would look like. But they were given the power to do that. And the regulators were also given enhanced powers at the time to take disciplinary action against senior managers. And this included the introduction of a criminal offence of reckless misconduct in the management of a bank, and that carries a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison and an unlimited fine. So really serious consequences for that sort of offence. I think it's fairly safe to say it's got a very narrow application. You have to be personally found culpable of bringing down a bank, and it is just a bank and potentially a building society. So it's a very narrow brief, but it is quite a serious new offence that was brought in. After we had some of the, I call them the eyeball, the FX kind of issues that came up in the industry, there was the Fair and Effective Markets Review, FEMA, as that's sometimes abbreviated to. And the conclusion of that was that the Senior Manager and Conduct certification regime should be extended into the fixed income, commodity and currency markets. But at the same time that was concluding and that review was happening, the Treasury was getting lobbied by ex-members of the PCBS, members of the Treasury Select Committee, because there are issues in asset management. There are also the PRA decided to extend the SM&CR to insurance firms as well. And so the Treasury decided back in 2015 they would extend the SM&CR to all other firms. And so now 4 years on, we're starting to see the implementation of that next month. One thing I wanted to note was when we get new regulatory regimes, you often get what's referred to as grandfathering. People get carried across from one regime to another regime. Yes, we've got that with the Senior Manager and Certification regime, but it's not quite in the same carte blanche way that we've seen in other regimes. The grandfathering for Senior Manager and Certification regime just really means you don't have to reapply to be a senior manager if you're a significant influence function under the old regime. And you do have to adhere to all the new standards, things like statements of responsibilities, management responsibility maps, reasonable steps, all of those provisions apply to you. And I think that's a material difference. Those of you who've some familiarity with the SM&CR might have seen variations of this pyramid. It's by far the easiest way to give you a very quick refresh overview of the regime. We've got 3 tiers. The broadest population at the bottom, the conduct rules population. Then it narrows to the certification regime and then narrows again to the senior manager regime. And that's sort of more reflective of the size of the populations that you have in each of those regimes. I've noted on the slide here some of the new concepts that we see in the SM&CR. One aspect I think that's not necessarily new is the concept of fitness and probity. And that you'll be used to perhaps seeing, does an individual possess the necessary qualifications, the requisite level of competence. What's new with fitness and probity under SM&CR is, do they have the necessary personal characteristics? What we'll do is we'll talk about that a little bit more, and what does that mean and what does that look like. The other point I wanted to just signpost for you is that the certification regime removed the approval process we had under the approved person regime. You may have come across the term customer function, CF30, that's probably the most common, or CF21 if you're into the jargon. You might have come across that before. The trade-off that we've got under SM&CR is that whilst you don't have those individuals going through an approval process or registration process with the regulator, they do have to have a certificate, and that certificate is maximum duration 12 months. And that's forced into practice now an annual review of the issue of those certificates, and what we're seeing in March next year is the introduction of what's known as the FCA directory. So all those individuals are going to be published in the directory on the FCA website, and that's really in response to consumer demand. They want to see who are the approved individuals in each organisation. So I'm just going to dip a little bit more, I'm going into a bit more detail now on conduct rules and the broadest population of people. I mentioned to you the PRA and the FCA were given the power to decide, did they want to introduce conduct rules, and if so, who would they be introduced for? The conclusion has been that the conduct rules will apply to the broadest population possible of every individual working in the financial services industry, except for what's known as ancillary staff. And that's very small population. It's broadly limited to security staff, receptionists, people who are not day-to-day engaging in the financial services sector. These conduct rules directly replace APA, the Statements of Principle for Approved Persons. So we'll see that old source book disappear, and COCON, or in the PRA's case, the Conduct Rules chapter of their rule book, will be replacing those. Really important to be aware that, sorry, I'm going technical now, but Section 64B of FSMA, the Financial Services Markets Act, that requires every regulated firm to ensure that individuals in scope of the conduct rules in that organisation are made aware of them, trained on them, and they understand how those rules apply to them. And I think because of the nature of the population you're talking to there, that's a broad number of people, the vast majority of individuals in regulated firms, you can't do that often enough. Remind them, refresh. I've seen people handing out things when visitors come to London in reception areas to remind them what the conduct rules are. You can't do that enough. And you can't make that training engaging enough so that people understand what those conduct rules are. I'll talk a little bit more later on about breaches of conduct rules and what that could look like in regulated firms. The other key point to note with the conduct rules is that rather than just have the ability to prohibit an individual from the industry, which is what the regulators had under the old regime, under this new senior manager and certification regime, the PRA and the FCA have got enforcement powers against any individual found to be breaching a conduct rule. We'll probably see that's most likely going to be a public warning, so a decision notice published on the FCA website, a fine, or ultimately it could also lead to prohibition as well. So a good topical example of that is a programmer creating an algorithm that results in a poor client outcome. You could see that causing a breach to the conduct rules and then the regulator wanting to take action in that situation. I've given you all the conduct rules here. I think it's quite useful to see what they actually look like day to day. Quite often people in risk and compliance don't always have cause to look at the rules. It's quite interesting seeing how they are. They are 2 tiers. They're written in, I would say, being an ex-FSA policy writer myself, they're written in a far more accessible, readable, understandable format than APA was ever written. So much easier to understand, so much more accessible. The word conduct you'll see in the rules and referred to is talking about professional conduct in the industry in the ordinary wider sense rather than limited to just conduct of business, which sometimes you hear the term conduct mixed up with because there is conduct of business sections of the rules. Each of these rules apply to an individual's conduct relating to the activities they perform in their capacity at work. They don't apply to an individual's private life, although there are examples of individual behaviour in private life that then affects the assessment of fitness and propriety. I'm sure you probably remember the former BlackRock senior manager who was caught at Cannon Street Station evading his train fares. The regulators found out about that, intervened and said the individual lacked honesty and integrity. And he was therefore no longer fit and proper and therefore prohibited from working in the industry. That was the only sanction they could apply to the individual, and that's the sanction that they apply to that individual. One other point I should signpost with these slides, I said they're a complete set of the conduct rules. Senior Manager Conduct Rule 5 on here only applies to senior managers of insurance companies. So if you've got senior managers in any other institution, that particular conduct rule won't apply to them. Moving on to a recap on the certification regime. This, for me, feels much more akin to the old approved person regime, particularly, as I've mentioned, the customer function CF30 and some of those roles. It feels much similar to that. And rather like the approved person regime, there was where there was a list of customer functions, you get a list of certification functions from both the PRA and the FCA. This time we've just got 2 lists because the PRA does one, very short, the FCA does one much longer list of certification functions. We've also still got the list of appropriate qualifications for individuals carrying on certain roles, such as giving investment advice. And we still have to carry on a competency assessment. And then we've got this slightly modified fit and proper assessment that we'll talk about in some more detail shortly. And the point that I think I made already is that what's really new is this provision of certificates that can last a maximum of 12 months, and the fact that come March next year we'll have this new directory listing the names of all these individuals in the certification regime. one interesting thing from those consultations on the FCA directory is, in response to lobbying from members of the industry, the FCA has agreed now that the membership of professional bodies will be included in that directory. I think that's quite interesting. I think that's a real positive for the industry. It should help with the building of trust and confidence in the industry. And I think it's a real credit to the FCA, the fact that they've actually listened to consultation responses. One note of caution on the FCA directory we might trip ourselves over on in future is that we have to keep the information in the directory up to date. The FCA is dependent on the regulated firm to tell them about what's changing. And they've listened to the consultation, and they've changed it from telling them within 1 day or 3 days, depending on the nature of the information, to 7 days. That is really not very much time to find out a change to an individual status, some information that needs to be updated on the FCA directory, agree that internally, and then tell them. And there is a sanction of a £250 administrative penalty that is levied if firms are found to be missing that deadline. And they hold the senior manager to account for that, for the people within their sort of area of reporting. So I think it's worth just having that on your radar as you implement the directory. And then we'll talk about the senior manager regime. So for senior managers, we've got the shift in emphasis on pre-vetting candidates before submitting an application to the regulator. We often, in the industry, call that Form A, the Form A submission when you've got a new senior manager. There's a particular form from the FCA website that you fill in and send on to them. The pre-vetting used to be a regulatory expectation. What's different with the senior manager and certification regime is that's now a statutory requirement. So that shifts the emphasis. It shifts the emphasis onto the regulated firm to make sure that that pre-vetting is done ahead of submitting the Form A to the regulator. There's also a requirement that once a year you have to consider if there's any grounds for the regulator withdrawing the approval of a senior manager. And if those grounds exist, then you need to tell the regulator about them. And you have to document it. So document the fact that you've done that review, document the conclusion of your review, and if there is anything you have to notify them, make sure obviously that you tell them. And the other key change to address that post-financial crisis issue of not being able to identify an individual senior manager with single responsibilities for a failing business or a function, we've now got a requirement to have a statement of responsibility and to have mapped all senior manager responsibilities into what's known as a management responsibilities map. And that makes sure that there's very clear apportionment of roles and responsibilities amongst senior managers, and that is always made available to the regulator. Just in conclusion on my quick recap, I wanted to give you this slide with the different SM&CR firm types. I'm often asked to explain the different SM&CR firm types. That's always met with surprise at how many different types of SM&CR firm there are. And that's largely because we've got the core enhanced and limited scope firms coming in scope next month. Those three categories are not, I don't think they're particularly new. They're broadly reflective of what we had in the approved person regime. And you had different levels of applicability of the approved person regime depending on what type of organisation you were. Really what's different to the approved person regime is you've got the banking firm and the insurance firm categories overlain on top of that. So before I drift too much into problem areas, let's talk about problems. We've had a quick recap on what the regime's like. These are some of the topics that I find come up quite regularly. They can be varying degrees of challenge in tackling them. And what I think we can just spend the next few minutes doing is just looking at some of these in a bit more detail, and I can give you some sort of ideas about how you can go about addressing them. So before I do that, just going to say defensively, I don't expect you to read this slide. I quite deliberately put a lot of detail on here because what you've got here it's an illustration. It is an unfiltered, complete list of all of the senior manager functions, irrespective of what firm type you are. And then that really horrible tiny font is all the prescribed responsibilities. And I think I've got a good reason for putting them in front of you. Partly because when you see the complete list, it gives you a clearer idea that actually these are very generic role descriptions. If you look, I'm looking on the left-hand side, and I'm not expecting you to be able to see what's on the right-hand side. And it's quite important to know that there is this big long list of all the different functions and all the different prescribed responsibilities. And the reason for that is that firms' businesses change. Your business model will change. You'll be applying for new permissions to do something different in future, maybe even giving up some permissions because you're changing your business in some way. It's really important to remember these prescribed responsibilities all exist. You don't want to be stuck, as I've seen happen in some organisations, trying to find a senior manager function who can take the whistleblowing responsibility the night before the form goes in. It doesn't work. And most senior managers are perfectly competent, capable of doing their job, and they will spot that there is a risk that they're being asked to take on. You need to plan right at the beginning of your project planning. If you're expecting a business change or putting in a new application, think about these, particularly the prescribed responsibilities. Easily overlooked and forgotten about. More to the point, these lists I've personally found they can actually be quite helpful when you're having that senior manager conversation and they don't want to sign the Form A, or they don't even want to engage with the Form A because they don't want to be registered. They are surprisingly useful because when you're having those most challenging of conversations, I would always firstly note the individual who is concerned about taking the responsibility on probably has a reasonable understanding already of the responsibility they're being asked to take on. So they're going into it eyes wide open. I think for me, I've always found that type of conversation tells me I'm talking to the right person. We've got the right person for the senior manager function. It's just a question of persuading them that they are the right person and they do want to take the responsibility on. Secondly, and you're not always necessarily aware of this going on in the background, but you can be fairly certain those individuals are having remuneration-related conversations with their seniors. And what they will be doing is looking to risk and compliance to help them find some additional information to help them demonstrate the delta of what they're taking on. This does genuinely happen quite often, and you'll find that will happen. You won't necessarily be aware of those negotiations. And on top of that, these generic lists really do help because you wouldn't expect to see multiple people performing, say, the chief finance role or the chief audit role. There is usually only one person doing that, and I think when you talk through with individuals, showing them all the senior manager responsibilities, it does very often become really quite clear that you've only got one person to look at. There are one or two roles, like, for example, the head of a key business area. That is subjective. What is a key business area? What does that look like? The best advice I can give to you in that situation is pre-agree some criteria with your senior management, your senior leadership team, about how you want to internally define what a key business area is, get it documented through the governance fora, and then it takes some of that subjectivity out of the one-on-one conversations that you're likely to have with individuals. Reasonable steps is by far one of the biggest challenges I think senior managers have had to contend with. There's multiple ways of documenting, evidencing reasonable steps. My view is what you do is you start by recording how the individual does their job. Then you've got the basic covered, then you can just focus on some of the major issues that you get documented at the time of those major issues coming up. What I've done on this slide is just give you some basic headers to record how individuals do their job, and if I give you some examples, for delegation for delegates, do the delegates actually know that they have senior manager function responsibilities delegated to them? Do they know the scope of their authority with those responsibilities? If that delegate attends a governance fora, do the terms referenced from that governance fora permit voting rights by delegates? And these are really simple, fairly administrative things that you can get right and save yourself some difficulties in the future. Handoffs is another point of discussion. When I say handoffs, what I'm talking about is, let's say you've got a head of a business unit and they're relying on, say, HR. Then when is the senior manager responsible for performance management processes, for hiring, for appraisals, and when is HR responsible for that? Where does it stop? Where does it start? Where does HR take that on? Where does the senior manager responsibility stop? These are really good quality conversations that senior managers can have with one another and with some of the departments that they have to rely upon. And getting those conversations done, documented, ahead of any future issues really does make things much easier to manage. I've often found that actually when it gets to, so HR is probably a simple example, but actually when it gets to IT and operations, I found that's where the conversations do tend to become a bit more passionate about who owns that particular system, who's responsible for the data, who's responsible for management of the system on the in-house software, and then who's actually responsible for deciding we want that software in the building in the first place. Those sorts of conversations can get very heated, but the end result is a clarity of role and responsibilities amongst senior managers that actually makes life a lot smoother and a lot easier to manage in the future. And really the whole point of documenting reasonable steps in this way, and why I think it's a good way forward, is because the senior manager and certification regime was introduced to be clear about which individual is accountable and which senior manager is accountable amongst that senior management team. So you really do need to have that debate and discussion now, while you've got breathing space, potentially before anything could go wrong, but also you never want to have those conversations in front of the regulator. The next sort of, not quite problem area, but hot topic is when individuals get called for interview by the regulator. This only happens for new appointments, so where you've got individuals grandfathered from the approved person regime to the senior manager regime, they won't get called for interview. Generally, so not everybody is interviewed. Generally, the sorts of people who are called for interview are individuals taking on roles in organisations where they've had issues. I think most people on the street have had Section 166s for financial crime. Therefore, if you get a new MLRO, it wouldn't be surprising if they were called for interview, or if you're going through a 166 for something like financial crime. It's not surprising that that happens. There are certain other roles that are more likely to be called, so compliance officers quite often get called for interview. New heads of branch or CEO quite often get called for interview as well. So it's worth having a plan for making sure those senior managers are briefed, to make sure they're comfortable with what they're going in to the interview, what their expectations are. It's nothing worse than going through the whole onboarding process, announcing internally you've got a new senior manager, and then they fail their interview. That's just horrific because of the cost, the expense, and then the internal damage as well that's done. So it's well worth getting them prepped, briefed. You can usually expect, when you go for interview, there's 2 or 3 people at the FCA. Usually one's taking notes, the other 2 are asking the questions. It's quite common these days they record the interviews, and you'll be told if they're going to record the interview, but that's not uncommon practice. Don't think there's anything sinister going on with that. That's purely their internal record keeping. It's It's probably also worth knowing that pretty much everyone in the regulator wants to get in on these interviews. It's got very good common currency externally, it looks good on the CV, so don't be surprised if there's quite a few people in the room. They have to really manage the population internally, it's so difficult. So don't be surprised if that happens. I said I'd get on to the subject of fit and proper and the sort of the real delta there. What I did for this slide is I've been through all the final notices issued to individuals since 2016. So we've got a few years worth here, and pulled out the key themes. So why was there a final notice issued to that individual? And what was the sort of the key driver behind the regulator deciding they weren't fit and proper? There are 31 final notices behind this list. The only individual who received a final notice in that period since 2016 was Jez Staley of Barclays whistleblowing fame. He was prosecuted under the senior manager regime. All these cases on this slide were prosecuted under the approved person regime. And that's not really that surprising. It always takes a few years for the regulator, when they have a new regime, to actually identify and conclude any investigations and then prosecute. So SM&CR is clearly no different in that space. What we've got here, though, I think is a good range of examples where the regulator's already been able to take action against individuals of not being fit and proper. I don't think we'd want to dispute that any of these examples wouldn't be good examples of an individual not being fit and proper. So what that really says to me is what you've got is a reporting and notification obligation to the regulator. Some issues will be very clearly misconduct and notifiable to the regulator, but what you really need to work out is the nuance of what are the individuals that you don't feel are reportable and notifiable, and that's quite a challenge to work that out. And we can talk about that a bit more when we get on to conduct breaches. I don't know if you noticed yesterday, because we were all here and in the conference, maybe you didn't spot it, but the FCA published a final notice to an individual of a Scottish mutual society, and he was paying his wife a disproportionate, in the FCA's view, salary to his wife from that mutual society. And the regulator, the PRA and the FCA consider that individual isn't honest, doesn't have integrity, and therefore is not fit and proper. Kind of unsurprising, but we should stick tax avoidance on that list as well because of that notice from yesterday. So we talked earlier about the fit and proper regime having a bit of a change, and it's moved on from does the individual have the necessary qualifications, possess the requisite level of competence, but also do they have these personal characteristics. So I've given you an extra section on honesty, integrity and reputation on this side, and some examples of things you could look at when you're considering those personal characteristics. Competence and capability, I think that's often thought of as being part of the annual staff appraisal. I've seen lots of assumptions made about what and isn't covered in that annual appraisal. And I would suggest that what you do is really check behind what goes into that annual appraisal, what is required to be documented, and maybe even go back to this list or a similar list just to go through and make sure you're really comfortable that that's covering, if that's what you're relying upon for the competence and capability part of your F&P assessment. And I think on financial soundness, most organisations getting past their very early day struggles with testing financial soundness, and they're finding proportionate ways of testing, getting criminal records checks, perhaps on a sample basis every year, relying on attestations from the individual's line managers. When I say line managers, no, line managers are not expected to know the finite details of an individual's financials, but they will hear that day-to-day chatter that will allow them to pick up on warning indicators such as gambling habits or debts or something like that, and that's where the line manager attestation can be very helpful. So moving on to misconduct, this is one area where firms not just having that nuclear "you are not fit and proper" option, but actually being able to identify and take action where lesser order issues kind of crystallise. Some of the sessions yesterday and today, actually we talked about conduct and how conduct is about behaviour and judgments. Misconduct can very often be discovered by watching who's working outside of normal working hours, when nobody else is around, when incentives are misdirecting behaviour, for example, commission creating a conflict of interest, and if that's not properly managed, then you can have issues coming out of that. There's plenty of academic studies, real life examples actually, and some excellent integrity type training available that reflect really that conduct is about discoverability. An individual is much more likely to moderate their behaviour if others see their actions and the outcomes of their actions. And that's really why the regulators are constantly talking about tone from the top, that really horrible phrase, permeating the permafrost. And if the day-to-day environment created by the leaders in an organisation is by leading by example, others will copy and follow those good examples, and converse is also true. So do set internal standards, explain those standards, ensure you can achieve consistency and a fairness of review when you're looking at individual cases. Make sure you take action, if that's docking the variable compensation or annual leave entitlement, and make sure people understand what those consequences are and why people are being subject of those consequences as well. So let's now think about the way forward with the SM&CR. For me, the key with SM&CR is about proactivity. Keeping yourself up to date with regulatory industry developments, like the final notice we talked about earlier. Keep the audit trail up to date. There is a lot of process documentation involved in SM&CR. Keep that up to date. It can quickly run away with you if you're not on top of it. And of course, there's lots of process and procedures, but being on the front foot when there are changes in your organisation, be that changes to your governance fora, changes to your business model, your licensing, that's your indicator that you need to step in, give some advice, make sure that you've got yourself covered and the organisation is covered, and that should help you avoid any sort of future bigger problems. One area of proactivity is putting in place a very simple framework. This is, in my view, simple. I found this type of framework, it's proportionate for the smaller, lower resource firms. It's scalable for the much larger organisations. We've heard about software that can cope with very large numbers of policies and procedures in them, allowing you to interrogate it. If you're a smaller, lower resource firm and you can't put a lot of software solutions in, you can put something like this in fairly simply with a few Word documents. You always have to document your ways of working if you're going to put a policy in place, so then it's of course worth putting some procedures in. I think that's relatively straightforward for aspects of the senior manager and certification regime. The one big tip I'd give you really is templates actually. The regime really lends itself to a few simple templates that cover things like your fit and proper assessment, your statements of responsibilities, get some consistency in what that looks like. It really helps you when you're engaging people internally because they get used to the format, the look and the feel. It also really helps head off those internal audits, the compliance monitoring reviews, or indeed the regulatory reviews, because things look and feel the same. It helps when you're putting your documentation in to apply for new senior managers with the regulator, because they get used to seeing very familiar looking documents from you. And if you put a relatively simple framework in place, training, I think, becomes much clearer and easier to identify what content you need to have, but then also who are your target audiences. And I think it naturally breaks itself into something like these 5 groups here. as I've said before, make sure the training's memorable, relevant, engaging, and the content then sticks. I think that's, it's easy to say, but there's plenty of material out there that can form some case studies to make it very real for people, bring things to life, bring about a discussion. When you talk about conduct with individuals, the room usually comes to life of its own accord. One example I've found, and I can thoroughly recommend, is the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment do a training called Integrity Matters. It's a case study based training. It's very engaging. I've seen it used over many years now, and without fail it's been a game changer for some of the attendees. And I would say I get no benefit for saying that at all. It's just something I've come across, and every time I've used it or I've seen other people use it, it's really brought things to life for them. It's superb. So the way forward, I think it's get some structure in place, particularly for reasonable steps. Make sure people are clear about what's expected of them, and keep yourself on the front foot. These are all fairly simple things to say. They're fairly simple things to do. It's just making those extra couple of minutes during the normal working day so that you can achieve that. And I think you will find that SM&CR can work for you and your organisation. Nearly lunchtime. Anybody want to ask any questions? I will put these slides up on my website tomorrow, so if you want to download them, you're very welcome to.
I have to confess to also being an SM&CR nerd.
Oh, great.
So, thank you for the presentation. But I'm sort of involved on the training side, and one of the things that I found the most problematic in the classroom, and I think for firms, is deciding whether it's a conduct breach or not, because of the failure of the regulator or the deliberate decision by the regulator not to discuss materiality and to give examples. So it looks as if the industry hasn't really got a level playing field, and people haven't been applying that consistently. And I think that's very problematic, because I think you could have some firms who are reporting multiple conduct breaches, which other firms are looking over and aren't, because they have a different materiality sort of barrier. So I think that's a real issue. But the other practical thing that is sort of linked to that is that there's now a two-tier reporting system on conduct breaches. So you've got the annual spreadsheet where you list all of your misdemeanours in October or whenever it is and send it off. But there's also the reporting within the tighter deadlines of misconduct, which may lead then to disciplinary action. And I think firms are really struggling to see which conduct rule breaches have to be reported quickly and which ones you can wait till the following October. So I wondered if you'd had any experience of guiding firms on that.
I have, and you're right, and super, thank you, because it's such a good topic. It's really difficult. So you have the annual Form H, which is due between September and October. That Form H is for all conduct breaches, and then there are, exactly as you say, notifiable breaches that have to be reported in a much shorter time frame, ad hoc during the year. Those sorts of breaches tend to be the really material issues where you found out that you didn't discover an individual had some criminal conviction for fraud. Think along the final notice examples. That's a good way of thinking, okay, if I have an individual in that situation, I should tell the regulator straight away. There are also unfortunately not that uncommon situations where individuals have had substance abuse problems. In those situations, what's interesting there is if you phone the supervision team or the contact centre, depending on what type of organisation you are, they're interested to know. They're interested to know if there is any question of lack of financial soundness in the individual because of the substance abuse. Otherwise, they don't seem that interested, which is curious, but they're not. Always put it on Form H. I would say every time phone them and tell them in that sort of situation. That's the one that I think has been just a curious one, and it'll be really interesting to see how that kind of develops if we do get any consistency around there. Otherwise, as I say, it's generally phone them if you've got those really major issues where an individual is being let go because of some form of serious misconduct. Always tell them about that. Those kind of fraud examples that you uncover when an individual's joined the organisation, non-disclosure during the recruitment process, that goes to integrity. That's the kind of thing they need to know about. And then the other issues that would probably go through your HR employee kind of appraisal process, dismissal, review type process, disciplinary sort of processes, that's Form H type material. That's broadly how I've seen people cut it up.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So just to develop on that question then, so in my own business, we have a financial services business, and we also have a healthcare business. And we've just brought in new levels of vetting for our medical staff who might work with vulnerable adults or under the safeguarding regime. And that looks at people's screening people through a local company in terms of the things that don't come up on DBS checks or whatever. Are you suggesting that we should really be looking at that sort of further in-depth screening of approved persons? Because that you talk about substance abuse or gambling problems or whatever, these in-depth screens will find that, but we're only using them in the sort of medical area at the moment.
So I wouldn't suggest that you have to proactively go and screen for that. I don't think the regime is looking to you to do that. But I think if you've got individuals who have substance abuse problems, present day, current, while they're doing their job today, that gives rise usually to inconsistent behaviour and attendance sometimes, and it can also give rise to situations of financial pressures, and that can cause the individual then to do things out of what would otherwise be normal behaviour. And that's where you need to be on top of things in that sort of situation. It's not to necessarily find out about the previous misdemeanour, they smoked something behind a bike shed once at school, that type of thing. It's surprisingly common. It's not about coming across that sort of thing. It's the much more serious material issues. Sorry, do you want to follow up?
So I had more in mind the point of recruitment.
Right.
In terms of recruiting somebody into an approved person's role, and actually looking to see whether there is, obviously they're not going to declare it at interview, are they?
People do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that's really what the regime's looking, and that's really the delta the regime's looking for. People do declare that at interview. It's happening more and more. They will declare not just those sort of substance issues, whether there's historical financial issues, fraud-related issues, criminal issues, perhaps they've had driving offences right through to other more serious issues. They declare it at interview. If they don't declare those sorts of things at interview and you subsequently find out, then you've got an honesty, integrity conversation to be had with the individual. Why didn't they declare it at interview? Because they're coming into a role where the regulator has a certain expectation of conduct and integrity and honesty, and so if they're not evidencing that during the onboarding process, I think you've got the basis for a strong conversation. But it doesn't necessarily mean screen everyone to perhaps the level of detail that you're doing with some of your healthcare staff.
Yes, please.
Can't somebody simply go into an interview and say whether I've got any convictions for anything is a matter between me and the authorities? I'm not going to say. Then there's no integrity problem at all, is there?
So an individual, certainly with a spent conviction, can absolutely do that. If they have current conviction that's relatively recent, then it does become a question of, are they the right person for the role? And I think if they, 9 times out of 10, the nature of things that people declare in interview, including criminal issues, they are matters that won't affect their role, that the organisation can say, that's fine, we can accept it, we're comfortable with you coming in and taking the role, thank you for telling us, that's the end of it.
Okay.
No comment. Does the FCA have to do SM&CR?
Yes. So they have put their own regime in place. They've got a management responsibilities map. It's slightly weird because of the nature of their organisation.
Yeah.
It's published on their website.
Yeah, so they go through it.
They go through it. It's kind of interesting. The colour schemes are ghastly.
That must be hilarious. Just think about it.
Yes.
Hi, sorry, just a broader question. Why is FCA looking to do SM&CR? So what's been missing and what they're planning to achieve in the future with this?
So what they're looking for, it's much more really politically motivated than it is regulatory motivated. And really what the politicians want is to be able to hold individuals to account when things go wrong in an organisation, preferably starting with the banks and working their way through some of the other organisations because of the nature of the problems in the crisis. And they really feel very, very let down by the previous regulatory regime that didn't allow the regulators to do that. It is incredibly difficult to prove a case against an individual and say you personally were responsible for bringing down whichever organisation came down.
It's quite ironic it starts with the politicians wanting integrity.
It's upside down, isn't it? Totally.
There's another thing to say, and that is that the city is an incredibly boozy place. So what's wrong with substance abuse anyway?
Well,
It manages to dominate the earth.
yeah, I think. I think it depends on the organisation and what they're able to tolerate. But social networking is very much, banks particularly and a lot of the financial services sector. It's all about stakeholders and network and managing the stakeholder and the network. And that a lot of people find that certain substances like alcohol can help smooth those conversations.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for
Thank
that
you very much.
insightful presentation.